Hello, Sherry. She remembered, and Robin remembered. So good to have one Winters checking in with us as we are mindful of the others. Um, Hopefully, people will remember in spite of my oversight to remind them to remember. So, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 46, and we should be able to power through the chapter today. We're not going to read a big chunk of it because it's a genealogy. We'll look at a couple of passages, a couple of verses from it. Um, and we'll discuss it. But since I don't have you with this arrangement, I can't have you help me read all these names, so I'm not going to do it all by myself. Genesis chapter 46, verse 1 through 4. So Israel set out with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here I am. And he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will close your eyes. Okay, what do we think about the opening four verses of Genesis chapter 46?
Do we ever have any indication? I'm not aware of any, but maybe you're aware of something when it talks about this. We see this quite often, of course, in the New Testament. God came to them in a vision of the night. But what does that really mean? It was apparent he knew that it was God.
The kind of, I guess you would say, technical term for this is theophany. It is the manifestation, a discernible manifestation, visible, audible. At times, maybe they can even smell or whatever. Take in the presence of God. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, these stories of the patriarchs are kind of delineated between each one. And there's a little bit of interchange time where they kind of overlap, but not a lot. I mean, especially Isaac is very much a transitional character, especially as an adult. He's not, they don't talk about him very much as an adult. They talk about him more in anticipation before he's born and then as a child. There is a pretty clear breakdown between Jacob to Joseph, but then Jacob keeps appearing in the Joseph narrative. And one of the things we can find between their stories, I think, is that these are two very different men. This is a case almost where the apple does fall a long way from the tree. Joseph is kind of presented as this kind of cool, calm, collected, I'm going to stay smart and wise and under control no matter how bad things get around me. And that's kind of the manifestation of his faith. But at the same time, there's no time in Joseph's narrative where God appears to Joseph. Jacob is a mixed bag at best, I think, from a morality standpoint and all that. But God does appear to Jacob repeatedly. So they're different people, they're different men, and it's not, I don't think, so much a sign that Jacob was a better person than Joseph or anything like that. It was just God had his relationship with Jacob and God had his relationship with Joseph. And I think they both believe in God. Joseph has made it clear he believes in God, but he does not have this type of interaction with God. And but God, even in this vision, indicates not just that he knows who Joseph is, but how much Joseph means to Jacob. And so that's one of the interesting things. It's a vision, it's a dream, it's trying to describe it precisely is probably beyond us because we don't have these types of interactions today.
Something foreign.
It is an appearance, though. It's a manifestation. He is aware of the presence of God. Can't look at God in the face, or whatever, but you see, he knows God's presence is there. And he's offered sacrifices. He's invoked some level of worship towards God as he is headed out. This is like if you're leaving, going west out of Walla Walla County, you stop at Burbank to offer sacrifices or something like that. I mean, he's on the very edge, the southern border of Israel, of Canaan, of the Promised Land. And Burbank is on the very edge of Walla Walla County. So it's like you're stopping there. So that's he is occupying his inheritance, the inheritance of the nation of Israel. And now he is being called to abandon that piece of property to people who place a great deal of significance in land. One of my uncles married a Chinese lady from Malaysia, and in their culture, you never sell land. You just absolutely do not. If you own land, you don't ever sell it. It's just passed down from generation to generation. She came over here, and she found out what it's like to be an ashlock, which means every few years you move, basically. And Gary, had a house in San Antonio, sold that house, moved to New Mexico, bought a house there. They stayed there for a while. The altitude didn't agree with him. They sold that house. They bought a house out in Washington, lived there for a few years, and then sold that house and moved back to Oklahoma and built a house there. And they bought and sold property in a way is totally foreign to her, because when you have that land, that is your land, and your family and your identity goes with that land. And I don't know it was quite that strong with Jacob, but a lot of cultures, it's very difficult to give up land. And he's having to give up the land for a time. God is taking the land away from him. And now he knows that's what's happening. And we haven't heard a lot of Jacob coming up with these plans and these ideas. There's nothing to indicate, God said, do this. This is Jacob's wisdom dealing with these situations and what he knows. But now God is, even if God didn't come up with it or suggest it, God is sanctioning it and assuring Jacob that he will be fine if he goes as he goes to Egypt. He needs to go. Yes, sir.
But basically, you covered everything I was saying. But the other thing that he did, he also told him that he would bring him back from Egypt. And, not physically Jacob, but
Israel.
Israel.
And he's Israel the person.
Right.
He's going to bring Israel the nation.
The nation's going to come back.
After he makes of Israel a great nation, he's going to bring them back. So it shows, we've talked about it a little bit, I think last week, but God balancing personal and eternal factors. And from a personal point of view, he's asking Jacob to abandon his land. He's giving him life, though, by doing that. Abraham had to abandon his home. So Isaac is, in a sense, doing it in reverse. He's leaving home, leaving what was promised to him in hopes and in confidence and trust. And that's one of the most important things. Whenever you see a story of God appearing to someone in the Old Testament, what is usually most important is not the actual manifestation. And sometimes we try to, it's kind of confusing, like the encounter where Jacob is wrestling. I have contended with God and prevailed. Is it an angel? Is it God? It's kind of hard to tell from the text. And that's not easy for us to comprehend sometimes. Most of us, if we saw God, it wouldn't matter what he told us. We would be so awestruck by the fact we were seeing God. But the stories as they're presented to us, the emphasis is not so much on the manifestation of God as it is what God is promising. That's the most important thing. And God is promising to safely get him into Egypt, to prosper him and his family in Egypt, and then bring them back to the promised land, to Canaan. And that is the most important part of it. How he actually manifests himself is interesting and kind of unknowable, perhaps to some extent. But we have what we have, which is a vision of the night, visions of the night, maybe coming and going, and all of that.
Apparently it's strong in the way in which God presents himself, which is not the way I usually see it today, but yet it's strong enough there. First of all, don't be afraid. So he kind of, there was an issue here, like, of the children of Israel doing certain things where they were afraid of it. But God presents them with this, okay, I'm with you, I'm going to take you down. And then he backed out.
Mhm.
Not only that, I will be with you. So now today we have the Bible, we have the Word of God that we follow and it's free. So when we look at things that happen here, they are so foreign. It's like where there in the time of Joseph and things like this happened. It wasn't a one-time event. It was the other time with God. So it's kind of a slippery slope to get over and try and understand. I think where they apparently had no problem. They recognized it. They accepted it.
Yeah.
They what I said. So it's just fascinating to see the difference between that time.
There was, amongst all the nations and peoples of that time, an acceptance of spiritual forces interacting with human beings. And even among, I think, some pretty devout, faithful Christians today, we don't think of that as ever happening. We don't think of that as possible. And I can't prove it happens. At the same time, when someone tells me that I was sick and God came to me and he healed me, who am I to tell them, no, he didn't? You know, that's you know, there was my brother was, I think, at some conference he was telling me about where one guy got up and made this very clinical and well-researched and well-cited argument about how the Holy Spirit doesn't perform miracles today. And the next guy got up and said, I was sick and the Holy Spirit healed me. Guess who won the argument? How do you respond to that? You can't. You can't tell people they can't. I had a friend that was Pentecostal, and I asked him if he could speak in tongues, and he goes like that. I got grip. No big deal. I got it. Who am I to tell him he can't? I mean, I don't. I can't speak in tongues. I can barely get anything out in English. So, but the manifestation is not so important. Moses, I've heard comedians make fun of the fact that Moses talked to a burning bush, but these people would not have been hung up on that. And that's something we can't. Why would God appear as a burning bush? It does, of course, show that the bush isn't consumed in all this. The Holy Spirit at times is a dove, at times it's a wind, at times it's a flame, it's a fire. So it's pretty consistent with some other biblical teaching, I think. And the main thing is that God made assurances to Moses, and that's what's important, is what God assures and what God promises.
I would say too that one thing that's common about that time and this time is the faith and belief in God. That I believe there is a God. I believe there is a Jesus Christ. Back then, there was a faith in which given the list of the faithful people of God and so forth. So there seems to be that tie between the characters of that time and us today that you can't separate. You can't break that faith or that belief.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the one thing that really, if you don't understand and read the Old Testament, you miss out on that connection. There's a full connection between everything. It's almost hard to understand the New Testament if you haven't understood it.
And their confidence in God, of course, this predates the law, but again, understood by people who were under the law. their confidence in their relationship with God isn't based solely or even largely upon their own personal morality. Jacob's not sitting around saying, I haven't been a very good person. I cheated my uncle. I cheated my dad. I cheated my brother. And he's not racked with guilt over all of these things. He has confidence in his relationship, in his calling. So when we are called and we respond to that calling, yes, we are supposed to be good people. It should transform our lives, but our failings, our mistakes do not cancel out God's will.
Same thing. That faith and belief in God goes from the Old Testament first through into what we're doing today. It's the same belief in the same God. And that was one thing when I went to Albania back in the 90s, that one of the people said, why are you bringing this Western religion? I said, this isn't a Western religion. This is an Eastern religion.
Yeah, it is very much an Eastern religion, and one of the most violent things we do to it is try to turn it into a Western religion. And
this is a continuation of what started back then.
I don't know what y'all think about how I handle the scriptures. My own thoughts on it, of my own treatment of it, I am trying to be very gentle with the scriptures themselves. And if it means ripping apart what I've been taught about the scriptures from a human being, then I will rip that apart. Because I'm going to come back to what does it say? What does the Bible say? And treat it, hopefully, in trying to treat it in a way that is consistent with how the earliest believers treated it. Not post-enlightenment, where human reason is the ultimate standard for everything.
Or a scientific way.
Yeah. Historic, any of that stuff. You can go back and there's records, and there's, Egypt, there's things that happen. They don't keep records like we do, but they had some records, and there is some indication of a Semitic people coming into Egypt and having some kind of leadership role. That's my understanding. Again, I'm not a big person in history on that stuff. But there is no specific mentioning of Joseph. And likewise, there's no specific mentioning of Esther, who was a queen in a foreign country. There's no historical record, secular historical record. So we can get hung up on that and use it to, as a lot of our opponents do, to try to poke holes into it. Or we can say, this is the message God has given us. And the point is not for us in following Jesus to go back and try to prove historically or scientifically that a man could live inside a well for 3 days, or a great fish for 3 days. That there's enough water on our planet to cover the earth completely above where it is now, over Mount Everest, whatever. Sometimes they find out something else is higher. Maybe they've determined another mountain's higher than Mount Everest. But last I heard, Mount Everest is still the highest mountain on the world. And it covered all of that. Those are kind of interesting discussions to have, and I'm not trying to dissuade those, but I'm saying we believe what we believe based on faith. We believe it not because we've seen it. We see it because we believe it. We have to have the belief first to see God moving through everything, to see how God, I think the world works in balance, that there's life and there's death, and some of it is violent, but it's still balanced. I saw there's a video going on Twitter today of a zebra trying to cross a river in Africa, and he's moving real slow. Probably not a real healthy zebra. He's just kind of plodding along through that water. And he gets up right on the bank and takes like one step, and a big old crocodile comes up out of the water and just misses him. And then the crocodile, it looks like he's mad. He's flopping around in the water. He can't believe he missed that zebra. I don't think the crocodile had quite that complex thoughts about it. But,
Well, you never know.
but you see that, and you can think random chance. You can think attempted violence and all that stuff, chaos. But I see it, zebras get eaten by crocodiles sometimes, and sometimes they get away from the crocodiles. And, crocodiles eat each other sometimes. It's there's life and there's death. And some animals exist primarily, it seems like, to feed other animals. I mean, That's why we have squirrels. So, some other critters can have something to eat. So, but I've never killed a squirrel, so don't get mad at me about that. But I have eaten squirrel, but I've never killed a squirrel. So, it all sounds pretty squirrely when you think about it. The appearance itself is less important than the promise given. And the appearance kind of serves the purpose of validating or lending credibility to the assertion, why you can believe it, why you can promise. I showed up here to tell you this myself, but the main thing is that you believe the promise.
The same thing applies to miracles of Jesus.
Yes. It applies about the whole life of Jesus.
Yeah, it wasn't the fact that the miracle says, I am from God, I am the Son of Man. It's not that he turned the water into wine. It's just a presentation of, I really am the Son of God.
His miracles, one thing, they show compassion a lot of times, healing, but they also showed a power over human reality. I mean, we can't walk on water. We can't turn water into wine. So it's, it proves his identity and gives us confidence in saying, when I go to prepare a place for you, it's happening. When he says, I will return, and that's the whole thing about the appearance. If Jesus was here once, he can come back. And especially when he came here by being born of a virgin. His miraculous conception and birth means he can return. And again, you get into the history and you get into the science, and a lot of people would mock all of that stuff, but they are using their human brain, and they think that's the highest source of wisdom and intelligence in the universe, is the human brain. And we believe that God's wisdom and intelligence, the weakest aspect of it, when there isn't a weak one, but whatever, the foolishness of God is far greater, infinitely greater than the wisdom of men. So,
Always wondered what God's foolishness was.
well, I see it every morning when I look in the mirror. That's God's foolishness. He was just having a goof, I think.
I just wonder if he laughed at us as much as we laughed at ourselves.
Well, anyone that doesn't laugh at himself is missing out on the jokes everyone else is getting. So, hi, Mindy. She says she's working tonight. Just stopping to say hello to everyone. So, hello to Mindy. Get to know she's out there and good things seem to be coming her way. Okay, verses 5-7. Then Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob and the little ones and their wives in the wagons which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. They took their livestock and their property, which they had acquired in the land of Canaan, and came to Egypt, Jacob and all his descendants with him, his sons and his grandsons with him, his daughters and his granddaughters, and all his descendants he brought with him to Egypt. Okay, what do you think about that passage? We could have just read the first 7 together, I guess, but it's a little bit of a divide there.
God wants him to do this. He does. It shows the follow-through. There's no question.
Any doubts Jacob has on the border of the promised land do not impede his journey.
I'm sure going into Egypt must be, in his mind, I would think, would not be the most logical thing. If it's logic, because they're not exactly the friends of.
No, I mean, the relationship between Israel and Egypt is a little bit complicated. It's mostly bad.
That's something that on his own, I don't think he would have wanted to do.
No. He's reluctant to send Benjamin down there. He's reluctant to, but they're starving to death. That's the only place with food. I should have mentioned this before we moved on, but the idea that Jacob will close your eyes, that is all this other stuff is kind of eternal. This is very personal. His most beloved, favored son, he will reconcile with, and that son will be able to honor him by providing for him in his death. And that's something, again, that's kind of changed in our culture today. I still see a lot of children, PD's a good example of that right now, honoring and caring for their parents in their declining years, and when they die, taking care of all the funeral arrangements and all of that. For Jewish people, I've talked about this before, but for the Israelites, under the law of Moses, you were supposed to be buried the same day you died. And burying someone, dealing with their body, brought you ceremonial uncleanness, which basically meant if you were going to be a professional undertaker as a Jew, you would be perpetually unclean, because you're unclean for a week, no matter what you do, all the purification and all that stuff, you would be perpetually unclean. I don't know how they do it now, so I haven't asked them that. But and there are some people, like the high priest, could not even bury his parents. He was absolutely forbidden from touching anything dead. And that puts the story of the Good Samaritan in a little bit different context. When you have a priest and a Levite avoiding what they think is a dead body, we see it as cold. They're not willing to show compassion to someone in need. They could have at least been just acting out of strict adherence to the law. They're not supposed to be touching dead. A priest can only touch his parents, for someone very close to him. So some stranger on the side of the road, he can't touch if they're dead. Now, he wasn't dead. They can help, but they can't touch a dead person. And so all these things kind of, when people say, I don't care about the Old Testament, I just want to read about Jesus, or I just want to know the New Testament. If you don't read the Old Testament, if you don't know anything about it, you don't have to be an Old Testament scholar. I'm not an Old Testament scholar. But if you don't know any of the laws, you don't know how they lived, then Jesus is speaking to you like he's a Martian or something. I mean, you don't have any context, any historical or religious context. Jesus was very religious. So he keeps the law perfectly. So to see these stories, to know what's going on in the Old Testament, it's helpful, and in fact, I think required when you're trying to understand the New Testament. But for Jacob to be told, your son Joseph is going to bury you, basically. He's going to be there when you die, and he's going to take care of your body. He's going to bury you. That is him being assured that you will be honored in your death. Your son, in a sense, you're one of two sons. One way of looking at it from Jacob's perspective, one of your two sons, your favorite son, is going to take you to your grave. And that is a very comforting thought for Jacob. That is God reassuring him. That's another assurance that comes out of this. And then when they go from Beersheba to Egypt, they're riding in wagons. They've got Jacob and all the kids, and maybe even the adults, but certainly the kids and the feeble, including Jacob, are riding in wagons. We've all probably seen movies that depict people going on the Oregon Trail from the Midwest in America out to the Pacific coast, and usually they show the whole family riding in the covered wagon. I don't think they rode in the covered wagon, at least not very much, because every pound you put in that wagon is more work those draft animals are having to do. You walk alongside that wagon. I mean, if those oxen or cattle or horses or mules or whatever are pulling your wagon die, what happens? You're not pulling that wagon.
You're not going.
Yeah. You're walking anyway, and you're leaving your stuff behind, basically. So they would walk, I think, and going back and forth. They had donkeys. The brothers had donkeys going back and forth, but they had all their stuff on the donkeys. So they probably didn't ride their donkeys either. They're to be seen as walking along. But now this is like a royal procession. Where do these carts, these wagons come from? They come from Egypt, right? They come because Joseph commanded them and he has authority. Pharaoh signs off on it. He supports it. So it is shown, it's to be seen as Egypt footing the bill for first-class travel, basically, for the whole family of Israel. Israel goes in to Egypt kind of on Egypt's dime, on Pharaoh's dime, and then that corresponds with their exodus. Again, sometimes we understand it as them, and the Passover is kind of in this context where they're eating hurriedly. They're supposed to eat squatting down, not reclining around a table or anything like that. Eat it quickly and get on the road. Fast food, basically. But it also says that, on their way out, all the people of Egypt gave them all their money because their firstborn had just died. And if they hang around, you're going to lose the rest of your family. So if your firstborn dies, you'll do a lot to get them out, the source of that death out. And so it says, I didn't look up the passage, but Israel plundered Egypt on their way out. They go in on Egypt's dime and they come out on Egypt's dime. In between, it's not too good. But the entrance and the exit, the beginning and the end, Egypt is accommodating. They are welcoming, hospitable in a sense. It's all at their expense. So this is a free gift of grace. We as people of faith see this as God moving to make it happen. And I think, the early readers would have seen it that way too, but they would have also kind of gotten a kick out of the fact that their arch enemies had to pay for all of this. It shows God making a table for them in the presence of their enemies. So that's something that's kind of going on there. Okay, verses 8 through 27 are the genealogy. And rather than read it all, I just want to make a couple of points. We're kind of running short on time anyway. I've talked about not skipping genealogies, and I don't think we should when we're reading them and studying them on our own. They are not the most efficient way to deliver theology, though. I mean, they're like a big desert with little nuggets of theology in them. But there are some here, and for one thing, in verse 19 and verse 22, Jacob's children with Rachel are specifically noted of being children of Rachel, both beginning before they're mentioned and after they're mentioned. The other list, the children are mentioned not strictly in chronology of birth. In fact, the fact that Joseph and Benjamin aren't the last two mentioned shows that. But the firstborn, and then all of his full brothers, and Dinah is mentioned as well. And then at the end of that, these are Leah's kids. And then you have, who is it? Is it Bilhah or Zilpah? Zilpah's children are mentioned after Leah's. Of course, they're somewhat ascribed to Leah because Zilpah was Leah's slave. And then you have Rachel's children, and then after that you have Bilhah's children, who actually were born before Rachel's. So this denotes, I think, to some extent, a greater level of honor to the children of Rachel, because she is mentioned before and after. And so these are the two that really, he had 12, but these are the two that really set his heart afire, these two sons. And it also establishes the tribes, and maybe why some of the alliances between the tribes existed, that this is going to be a nation. At the same time, it's going to be subdivided into tribes. At times, the tribes go to war with each other. The tribe of Benjamin is almost completely obliterated at the end of the book of Judges. The tribe of Benjamin has a story in it that is remarkably similar to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. So there is subdivisions within this nation. There's total, again, another important point is that there is a total of 70 persons who make the journey. His whole family, Jacob's family, totals 70 persons. And 70 is a symbolically important number. It's not the most important number, but it's pretty important. It is a factor of 7. 7 is a very important number because 7 represents creation and rest. It's a factor of 7. It's also a factor of 10, and 10 is an important number because you have 10 commandments. So it is, in a sense, a blending between creation and rest and commandment. That's what's going into Egypt. So it's not, these genealogies are not the way we would do genealogies or try to do genealogies where we're trying to include every single person and every, it is more of a symbolic or a theological message that it's still a small number. But from a small number of 70 people, I mean, if you were an Israelite reading this, our whole nation came from 70 people. You know, more, you can't count the sands on the seashore, but that's not anything like your nation is going to. So this great and powerful nation that comes up out of Egypt went into Egypt with only 70 persons. Their personal identities and all that are still balanced with the national concern. Well, this is how our nation got started. Okay, quickly, verses 28 through 34. Now he sent Judah before him to Joseph to point out the way before him and to go to Goshen, and they came into the land of Goshen. Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as he appeared before him, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a long time. Then Israel said to Joseph, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face, that you are still alive." Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, "I will go up and tell Pharaoh, and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household, who were in the land of Canaan, have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. When Pharaoh calls you and says, 'What is your occupation?' you shall say, 'Your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers, that you may live in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is loathsome to the Egyptians." We've already seen how the Egyptians, when they're having the dinner with Joseph and his brothers, they don't want to really have anything to do with his brothers. And this is why. They do not like shepherds. And it is, in a sense, a personal failing of the Egyptians, we could say in our context today, to be xenophobic, to be fearful of cultures, to have disregard for cultures that are not your own. God uses that mindset to allow the people of Israel to dwell within Egypt, surrounded by Egypt, but still distinct and isolated from Egypt. So they're not intermarrying. That's one of the things that's going on in Canaan, is they are intermarrying with Canaanites. They risk the loss of themselves as a distinct people through intermarriage. And some of it, we've already seen it where they said, well, you marry our daughters, we'll marry your daughters, and we'll all be one big happy family. But that name is going to bear a Canaanite name. They risk becoming Canaanites, basically, instead of Israelites. So in Egypt, they're going to be allowed to be distinct. There's enough of them in order to propagate. It is, by our standards, incestuous, but they're going to create a distinct line of people, a distinct nation. And God is using that, feeling that thought about their distaste for shepherds to keep Israel distinct and separate. He uses the same thing. He uses another moral failing, this time of Pharaoh in the Exodus. He uses Pharaoh's arrogance against Pharaoh. Pharaoh's heart gets hardened over and on, and God says, "I will harden his heart." How does God harden his heart, though? It sounds unfair, doesn't it, to harden somebody's heart? But how does God harden Pharaoh's heart? By giving him opportunity after opportunity to obey him, knowing that he won't. And when he doesn't, every time his heart gets harder. So he uses the moral failings of Israel's enemies to provide for Israel. And Jacob's kind of statement, I can die now that I've seen you. Well, he lives, according to the next chapter, chapter 47, verse 28, lives another 17 years in Egypt. So, and that's been kind of something we've seen in the Jacob story. It's always like, when he steals Esau's blessing, the thought is Isaac is about to die. He's on his deathbed. But Isaac is still alive over 14 years later, when after Jacob goes and sojourns with Laban and all that, he does it for 14 years to get the 2 wives and comes back. Isaac's still alive. That's a long time to be on your deathbed, 14 years. And they have time to reconcile and everything. So, Esau and Jacob are both at Isaac's burial. Jacob's ready to die now. I've died. I've seen Joseph again, but he's going to be there for a while still. And they will go present themselves to Pharaoh. And we will look at that starting next week. I'm sorry I kept you over just a little bit, but I wanted to finish up the chapter. Mr. Kelso, will you lead us in a closing prayer, please?